Okay, I was just looking. I didn't. This is why I paused after I let a couple more people in. I've been so busy just focusing on each week's lectures and grading papers and all the other stuff involved in teaching the class that I hadn't noticed that my storage capacity is near its limit. So that could be a problem for people who aren't here tonight to see this lecture. So that actually clinches my decision to make this a shorter class than usual, which would mean we're not going to take a break unless anyone objects. I don't think anyone will. I did the same thing last night. We'll just go through, we'll cut probably, in fact, for sure, we're going to cut one of the slides from tonight's list. And then we will probably end an hour early. Hopefully the recording will have enough space on it to, I assume that warning is just a heads up before, you get to the better end of your storage. I know I'll have to do all the deleting and, rearranging of files after today before we start next week's classes. So it shouldn't be a problem. In any case, I'm recording at the moment. So hopefully, anyway, you guys are going to see the lecture, but you will want to review it before the final. Okay. Tonight's topic is Gothic art, including, of course, cathedrals and sculpture. I think some people, when we first started the class, I do remember getting some emails from people before even the first session that people were assuming we're going to cover goth as in Goth, not Gothic art, the whole lifestyle that goes with that, which many of my daughter's friends in high school, of course, have been participating in. Just a quick, I can't help it. I know it sounds silly, but as a fatherly, whatever pride, my daughter got her first job today at Safeway, and it's walkable, which my first job was an hour, not an hour, a mile and a half walk from my house, and I didn't own a car either, so that was a lot longer to get to work. It was at McDonald's, so this is a better job than McDonald's. You don't have to wear a uniform. You don't have to clean up all the time and get grease and salt in your fingers and face. Yeah, I hated that job at McDonald's. That was my first job. So I'm pretty pleased to hear that. She just got the call today, right before class. So, okay, here are a couple of quick announcements because we want to get to the lecture and see if we can end maybe even a little earlier than 8:30. Depends on how many questions you have. I don't have some people's papers yet, second papers. That's okay. But I'm going to give you an incentive to try, if you've been working on them and you know what you want to write, or even have been, composing, but haven't quite finished it, polished, whatever, the text. If you can get in by, I'm going to say 2 a.m. Okay, got another person to let in here. Hi, welcome. If you can get it to me by 2 a.m., that's an extension of a few hours, like in the wee hours this evening. It won't be counted a whole week late. That makes a difference. It could make all the difference between your grades because of your final. I'm talking about class grade. It's 5 points off if you get it in within a week, anything under 7 days. So I'm giving maybe a couple of you would have that advantage or benefit. So if you can get it in before I see my emails in the morning tomorrow, it won't be counted a whole week late, just 5 points off, in other words, instead of 10. And I've seen people miss an A or a B by less points than 5. So it could matter. Okay, let me do the full screen here because I have two more things, one of which is to show you a drawing I made last semester that many students told me helped them about what are the main features of Gothic architecture, which is definitely going to come up absolutely in one way or another on the final. Okay, but extra credit. I've sent the about a week ago, right? The extra credit options, they're already printed out at the bottom of page 1 and top of page 2 of that handout that some of you wouldn't still have or have misplaced, whatever, deleted the course grading policy. So I resent it, but anybody can just ask me at any time and I'll send it again. No one has maxed out their extra credits is my point. 50 points extra credit will give you a nice cushion or margin for error, depending on how you do, of course, on the final. And it can't hurt. And it obviously makes a difference for a lot of students between an A and a B, or even a B or a C, whatever, a whole letter grade's difference if you maximize the extra credit option. So if anybody wants that individually, you can't find it for some reason from the first week when I sent you the course grading policy PDF, I can resend that. And then you can see for yourself what the options are. Okay, but does anybody have any questions before we launch into tonight's topic about anything relating to the second paper or extra credit or grades in general? Anybody? Okay, so let's do this. Let me hold up this, and this you'll probably want to take, well, maybe some of you will, a screenshot of. Not that it's great artwork, it's what my dad would call Mickey Mouse art. He was a really good artist. Supported a family of 6 people in first Chicago and then LA on a freelance artist's salary, which was not a salary, it was freelance. So he was a good drawer. I'm sort of like minimal, but this is adequate enough. I raise my fingers off the top so you can read that. This is part of what we're going to cover tonight. In fact, it's the main topic, and it will come up, like I said, for sure on probably in 2 ways. On one of the slide essay questions where you'll have to analyze the style of a building of a Gothic church, and probably both also in the true false section. Remember, the final is not cumulative. But it's exact same format, same number of slides, same point total, 100 points as the midterm was. Okay, so I'm holding it up long enough for anyone who wants to take a screenshot. Otherwise, you'll see it hopefully if this does have enough recording space left for me to get the whole lecture in, or at least the beginning, on YouTube. Remember, I post them by last weekend. I got delayed on Friday. We had a family situation I had to deal with, so I didn't get them in until like 4 or 5 on Saturday. But they're usually, and this week they will be up by 8 p.m. on Friday, this week's lecture. Okay, so you see the 5 features. We're going to talk about them rather than label them now verbally with this drawing and point to them with my finger. That's even worse low tech than just this drawing, holding up a drawing. It nonetheless is accurate, and it will help you if you refer to it when you're studying for the final or reviewing the video of this lecture. Okay, so let's just do a very quick context is what I call it, overview. Gothic is the last period of medieval history and art in Europe, roughly from 12 to 1500, what would be the last 300 years of the Middle Ages. And I said this last week, remember, the Middle Ages was not all the Dark Ages. The whole thing wasn't one solid era of ignorance and superstition and violence and wars and hunger and plague. Yes, those things continued happening. Certainly, they quite frequently happened in Europe between 1200 and 1500. But at least by that time, cities were growing. There was a slowly expanding middle class or professional class, people who had a little more ability to support themselves, their families, make a slightly better life than peasants, who was what 98% of the population of Europe in the Dark Ages. The first 300 years of the Middle Ages were in dire poverty and living as peasants, literally in essence slaves to the masters that owned their estates. So things had changed a bit. There was a little more freedom. There was a phrase, city air makes one free. And that is a very good summary of what was happening, because the cities allowed people to have these options to get different kinds of jobs or professional training, even, apprentice to somebody. And then, of course, earn a better living. But it also allowed them a little more freedom. They could go to universities. That's the other thing that was growing. So there were 3 things that happened during this period in terms of the society. So just briefly, the second was that the universities had existed in the Muslim world. We covered that, and they barely got started toward the late Romanesque era. But by the 1200s, most major European cities, in Western Europe at least, had universities where you could go if you were, able to teach yourself to read, or, had learned, before you applied. Of course, you had to be literate to go there. And then the third thing was trade, exploration. Of course, we know, obviously, along with that, with colonialization, that's a hard, long phrase, the colonizing of so much of the rest of the world outside of Europe. And that had its negative consequences. But in any case, in Europe, it had, and then later in other parts of the world, of course, some benefits, which were, more knowledge of the world, of the little beginnings of science was around this time. People were starting to study the aspects of, human body and the movements of the sun and the earth, right? I think you guys know some of this. So it's a period of expanded learning and knowledge, but it's still a pretty brutal period because people were still, under the thumb of kings and queens and local tyrants, if you will, lords and nobles. And yet they built these beautiful, beautiful structures. If you've never been to Europe and you ever go, I assume you'll want to go inside a couple of Gothic cathedrals. So we're going to focus on that for the first part. And then we'll talk about sculpture. And next week, well, actually stained glass windows too, and then do more next week. Okay, here we go. Let's get started with the first slide. And it's a really important slide. I would say that again, based on, here, let's get this, hide these here. The fact that this is one of the most important slides this whole second half of the semester, it has a high possibility of being on the final, either in the slide ID part or the slide essay part. Okay, so what is this one? This is Church of San, and they always abbreviate it. Yes? Hello? Someone else wanted to join. It doesn't say that on my screen. It says screen sharing, so it should be, right? Unless there's something at your end. Hopefully, right? Usually I ask that, but I thought we, just proceed here unless there's some glitch I'm not aware of. It shows that it's screen sharing, right? Okay. All right. So this is the title now is the Church of Saint Denis. Remember, in French and even other parts of the world, the word saint is abbreviated, ST period. If you want to write it out, if it's on the exam, you can, but I just abbreviate it. So Church of Saint ST period Denis, that's like the word Dennis, we would say the name Dennis, DENIS. Last word, it's a long one, ambulatory. And I'll explain what that is in just a moment. Ambulatory. So it's Church of Saint Denis Ambulatory, AMBULATORY, France, the location France. And the date is 1145. Okay, so why are we looking at this? It's just a bunch of columns and arches. Who cares, right? Oh, this is a really, what's the word? Seminal, there's the word. Seminal work of art. In this case, a seminal piece of architecture. Meaning it changed the course of that medium, in this case, again, architecture, from that point forward. It's the first, here we go, this is what you should be starting to write on the meaning. It was the first Gothic church in the world, ever. So the Gothic style was invented in France, right, in the 1100s. It took a while to catch on. That's why we usually give you the dates, roughly 1200. By that time, that style had dominated most of Western Europe, of course. It wasn't in Russia. They had their own styles there. But in Western Europe, it became the dominant style for churches all over Western Europe by 1200. But it starts in France, and here's the first example. But what are we looking at? Well, an ambulatory is a walkway. So let's get a little closer look. That curves around the back end of the church behind the altar. So I'll say that again. The ambulatory is what we're looking at, and if it's on the exam and it's on the essay part, you would need to write this, is explaining what we're looking at. Of course, is a section of the church which is near the back end. It's a curved walkway that goes behind the altar. So of course, it's where the priests would prepare for the services and all that. Mostly the worshipers don't go there. Right, but now this church is a World Heritage, UNESCO, right, World Heritage Site, because it's so important. So what makes this Gothic? Well, we can see two of the features here out of those five, because we're looking at just one section on an interior-only view. The other features we're going to see on the very next slide are only visible on the exterior. So what are the two main features this slide shows us about this building that make it Gothic style? Pointed arches on the doors and windows. This I used to think was a doorway, but I looked more closely at a different view of it, and this is actually a window too. But all the doors, the point is, in most Gothic churches, there are a few exceptions where only some of the doors and windows, but in most Gothic cathedrals and or even smaller Gothic churches, all the doors and windows have pointed arches. You can see that. It's even on the ceiling here. And that's the second feature. So let's go up close and you'll see this a little better. Gothic groined with an ED vaulting. It was on my hand printed diagram. Last week we saw Romanesque groined vaulting. That means the part of the ceiling where the arches meet. Look carefully and you'll see they are pointed. These arches are pointed. They're not curved or rounded like the Romanesque groin vaulting. Of course, vaulting is the way the ceilings are supported in any open ceiling, right? That's not beamed. The other method is wooden beams. Obviously, that applies to houses and maybe some other buildings. But in a church, it's made out of stone, of course. So this is lined with brick. You may be able to tell that, but it's just decorative surfacing. But this is all stone that supports the weight of the roof above it and the towers. There are 2 towers on this church. So the groin vaulting helps supports both the roof, the purpose of it, and the towers above it. Okay, let's get this person in. Hello, welcome. We just get started as our first slide. Okay, and then there are stained glass windows here, but these are not unique to Gothic architecture. Let's get up a little closer to this one here. And actually, you can see all 3 here. Stained glass windows become a high art or a major feature of a Gothic cathedral or a Gothic church, but they aren't basic to Gothic architecture alone. They were present as early Romanesque 900 AD. They're stained glass windows that old, and some of them still in perfect condition in small churches throughout Western Europe. So stained glass windows are just one extra feature that is always present in a Gothic church. It's not one of the main features. That's why I didn't draw that on that diagram that I held up for you a few minutes ago. Okay, and then another feature that's typical of Gothic churches is clustered, with an ED, clustered columns. You see them here on this edge of this one large window, which is a stained glass window, by the way. Those are columns that are, they're not short and stubby. You notice that they're tall and narrow, but they're clustered, grouped together. Now, that wouldn't make sense for the columns that support the ceiling. I mean, they could have done that, but they do use them around all the windows usually. So you see clustered columns, let's just say around the walls. Okay, so let's do the formal analysis. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I almost forgot a very important fact. One last thing about the meaning. The architect who created it was the bishop, Suger, Suger. It's almost looks and sounds like the word sugar, but he has nothing to do with the food item. Suger, last name, bishop. You should know that because obviously he's an important person in the history of architecture. He invented this style. But as you might recall from the slides during Islamic art that week's lecture, the pointed arch was invented by Muslim architects. So how did that happen to come into France at this late time? Well, it's after the Crusades. They pretty much wound down by this time. Well, then actually they were still going on. Yeah, that's right. The late Crusades continued well into the 1100s. So just say during the later phase of the Crusades, some of the soldiers or officers, really the educated ones would have been officers who had been to the Middle East. Of course, that's where the Crusades were. I think everyone knows that, in Israel and around Israel. When they came home, they brought the knowledge of this new system of design. But remember, this is the last part of that last fact about the meaning before we do the formal analysis. Remember, in Muslim architecture, pointed arches are not used to support the weight of anything. They're just decorative. So it was Bishop Suger who deserves, this bishop who designed this cathedral. He was the architect. Remember, the bishops were the architects. There were no architects as far back. There were some in the Muslim world, there were actually, who just spent their whole life designing buildings. But in Europe, this far back, no, they would have been bishops designing their own buildings and then working with engineers and master builders, they called them. And the master builder could have been trained in architecture, but usually the design proper was done by the bishop. So he was the architect, Bishop Suger. And what he thought of that's uniquely his is the idea of using these pointed arches like we just saw here on the Gothic groin vaulting. And on the windows, it also supports the weight. The pointed arches on the doors and windows are not just decorative. They help support the weight. They're stronger than a rounded or Roman style arch, the only kind of arch that had been used in Europe for thousands of years before that. So the idea of occurring to him is how he legitimately deserves credit for being the father of Gothic architecture. Plus, he came up with all the other features that we're going to see on an exterior slide, the next slide, of another Gothic cathedral. And I'll describe those when they're on the screen. Okay, so let's wrap up this slide. What we have here is a balance. Really, pretty much, it depends on where you draw the line. But if you do it down the middle of the groin vaulting and the ambulatory, there's going to be columns on this side, and you can barely see there are columns on the other side too. Of course, there'd have to be. I mean, even though the picture cuts off the other end of the arch, I can tell you, I've been in this church a couple times. It's a pretty famous place. I don't know how many tourists go there, but architecture and history buffs do. So I've seen it, and I can tell you there's a row of columns exactly the same on the right. So it's totally symmetrical in terms of left to right. Top to bottom, that's up to you to decide. I give you credit on whether you think it is, because the width of the floor and the width of this section of the ceiling, because the ambulatory is just this section here, right? That's the same width, but there's a lot more mass up here, isn't there? The ceiling, by the way, in terms of mass, is the largest mass. Then it would be the arches, right? With the cost that really it's all one mass, the outer edges of the windows, and then these narrow columns would be the third largest mass. But back to the fact that just to clarify, in terms of balance, you can make the case it's unbalanced toward the top, toward the ceiling, because of the weight of all these arches. All right, then the colors: warm on the ceiling, cool on all of the other interior walls and columns, right? Most of it's cool. Certainly the floor is cool. It's kind of an off-white color. But there's a mixture, of course, in the stained glass windows. Obviously, stained glass always is a mixture of cool and warm colors. So then we have lines. Here, the lines are painted on the window. So there is painted line here, and carved on the tops of the columns. And then there are visual lines around the arches. So all three kinds of lines are present here: carved, painted, and visual lines in different parts of the building. For space, it's a long, narrow aisle, you can say, or walkway. Either word, we'll use aisle or walkway, with about a 15-foot high ceiling. It's not very high. This part of the church doesn't have those soaring ceilings that you'll see in some of the other slides today. So 15-foot high ceiling. So that's a real space, of course. And then we have the rhythm. Obviously, the arches create rhythm, the framing, around the windows, the clustered columns, the narrower columns in the middle, lining the aisle. So there's lots of rhythm everywhere you look. And the textures are only real. Well, you could make the case this is simulated texture. Actually, it is, because it's carved leaf patterns. So there's minimal simulated texture at the top of the columns. All the other textures, and here they are real. Real rough brick, real rough stone, and real smooth glass. Those are the three real textures. If you could see the stained glass windows, you're going to see one up close from Notre Dame in Paris. But you can't here. You could describe some simulated textures that are painted, because there's always some kind of figures, holy figures in the Bible or human figures on stained glass windows, but you can't see them here. So you can just say the real smooth texture of glass, and of course, rough textures of brick and stone. Okay, modeling is just the shadows from the sun. And it is both stable and dynamic. Stable on the columns and the floor, and dynamic everywhere else. The entire ceiling, the tops of the windows, and if you could see the doors, they would be too. Okay, all right, moving on. This is also a slide I'm not cutting from the study list. Has a high possibility of being on the final. Our second must know: Chartres Cathedral facade. And Chartres is Chartres. That's a city in France. It's about 100 miles outside Paris. Again, Chartres, Chartres Cathedral facade. For me, the mispronunciation of my Indiana relatives helped me spell words like this all the way through my art history career at UC Berkeley. It may help you. Facade is how my favorite aunts would pronounce that word. It's facade, of course, F-A-C-A-D-E. So again, the title: Chartres Cathedral facade. Location, of course, France. And the date is 1260. This is the second Gothic church ever designed, period. That's the first fact about it. Only the second Gothic church ever designed. And the bishop here consulted with Bishop Suger to design this church. He probably went to, by the way, Saint Denis is a suburb of Paris now. It was a separate town back in the Middle Ages, but now it's a greater Paris, right? So he probably traveled to, the Paris region or area to meet with Bishop Suger. Maybe not. He might have just looked at copies of drawings and things. In any case, he consulted with Bishop Suger. But if some of you are thinking, maybe about the dates and say, wait a minute, 1260 and 1145, that's more than a century apart. Yes, here's the explanation. These churches, I know some of you know this, took at least a century to complete from the time they were designed. Bishop Suger was able to finish his church faster than most because it's smaller than most Gothic cathedrals. It's about half the size of this one, by the way. The towers are maybe a little over half that tall. We'll see how tall everything is, the dimensions and all when we get to the formal analysis, of course. But first, about the meaning and the design of it. Bishop Suger was happy to share his new ideas with any other bishop. And the first one to do that was, and I don't know his name, you don't need to for this building, but Chartres Cathedral, being the second oldest Gothic church in the world, or the second ever designed, is an important fact, but even more so is that it has very unique features that make it another UNESCO World Heritage Site. This building is visited by 2 or 3 million people a year. Well, not during the pandemic, of course, but before the pandemic, and maybe again sometime soon. Why? Because of two things. One is that the stained glass windows are considered by many people, we'll just say people, not just critics or historians. So we'll just say these stained glass windows in this church are considered by many people to be the most beautiful in the world. I would err on the side of Notre Dame. I'll show you those windows when we get to that site in Paris, of course, the one that almost burned, right? Or did burn, yeah. So here, the stained glass windows are lovely. It's a matter of personal preference. If you like the deeper, darker colors, because they're deeply rich, saturated colors in the windows. I'm not going to show you them because one set of stained glass windows is enough for one lecture.
I don't spend that much in a year on flights.
No? So what
Great,
features?
because I'm going to buy the tickets anyway.
Okay. Sorry.
It's great.
Start over here. All right.
I like the meeting with Riley one-on-one tomorrow for the very first.
You want to turn off that mic? Sorry, one person's mic is on, or yeah, if you could, just for the rest of the lecture. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so what we have here, let's go up close, are the other three features we haven't seen yet that I put on that chart, that diagram, I mean, that I held up to the screen, and which you can see if you joined us late on the video of it on YouTube by Friday night. And that is tall, tapering spires. You see that both towers have tall tapering spires. Now, some of you, I'm sure, are thinking, how come they look different? They look vaguely similar because they have the pointed arches. Yes, all the windows in the towers are pointed arches. Well, there's an explanation I'll get to. It's no mystery why the two towers look so different, but they are both tall tapering towers, and they therefore part of the Gothic style. Okay, then we go down to the rose window, which is a magnificent piece of stained glass. Rose windows are literally round, gigantic. I mean, I've never seen one less than 30 feet across. The largest ones I'm going to show you are at Notre Dame in Paris, 40 feet. This one's about 35 feet. So I'll mention that again when we do the formal analysis. But in any case, the rose window is a major feature of all Gothic cathedrals. It's always right in the center of the facade. And it's a huge round stained glass window. There's no other way to describe it. And then the third feature we couldn't see from the interior are the flying buttresses. Now, I've had people, whoops, let's go up close again, I mentioned, say, what, I used to demonstrate those against the wall in Anneley Hall. I could use my back and my, from my head to my toes and my arms to explain. It's just not that practical to do that in the space I have here in my bedroom in my house. So I'm just going to state this fact that you should write in the notes on the meaning of this slide, of course. Flying buttresses were what made these tall towers, these incredibly tall towers possible, because they are buttresses that only attach to the wall at the upper end. I would do it this way. If you can visualize this, otherwise just write it, so you have it in your notes. It's like, say, a row, and these are always, there's always a row of these. You're going to see them from the outside of Notre Dame all the way around the building. I have my own slides of that. Then you won't have to take notes just for a few minutes. We'll get to that in a couple more slides. But the point is just say there are rows of these stone buttresses. A buttress is obvious. Everyone knows what that means, right? It's something supporting something else. So these stone buttresses are different. They're unique. They were not thought of by anyone before Bishop Suger, because most buttresses line the entire surface of the wall they support. That's called a clasping buttress. You won't have to know that term for the exam, but you should know what a flying buttress is and how it's different. Flying buttress is almost like someone taking their arm, a row of very strong people, taking their arms and extending them onto the wall that they're supporting, like, say, giants or something, superheroes, whatever. Obviously, that'd be very tall. Stretching their arms out in rows, every 10 feet or so, there's another flying buttress. And it's their arms that carry the weight of the building down from these massive towers. So let's say all that. You imagine how much weight this is, how much pressure, because of obviously the gravity, the force of gravity, pushing down and out. Always in a building. You don't have to be an engineer or an architect or even have any, specialized experiences with buildings and how they're built to know logically, right? The weight of all buildings, especially a tall one like this, is pushing constantly. The stress, it's called in architecture, is in engineering. It's pushing down and out, because that's what gravity makes the pressure do. So these flying buttresses are much stronger than a clasping buttress. Don't ask me how to explain that. I'm not an engineer. All I know is that they are stronger. And by using a row of these flying buttresses, where only the upper part is attached to the wall, the weight goes down from the top of the spire. Right, let's go on up to that. Let's see if I can do that. Yeah, from the weight where it starts and then goes down, along the tower, obviously. Whoops, just want to do this. And then it goes into the buttressing through the arms. I call them arms. They're like stone arms. And then the weight keeps going down, the stress or pressure from the weight into the ground. So clasping buttresses don't have any real connection to the ground per se. They're just attached to the walls. They help support to some degree that wall they're attached to, but these are much stronger. So there we go. That's a unique revolutionary idea. It's an engineering revolution. That's a good way to put it. You could even say that if this or any other Gothic church. Well, I can tell you for sure one Gothic church will be on the final. It's such a uniquely advanced concept. And the fact that these took 100 years to build shouldn't surprise you. And yes, hundreds of people died building these churches. Not all at once. Well, sometimes a dozen or two might, if a scaffolding failed. But yeah, there were accidents. You're talking about 300 feet above the ground here. So that's pretty much the whole meaning on this slide, right? The style, the features of it, and how it got designed. So let's do the form analysis. And let's start with the two towers. The spires are only the tapering part at the top, right? But that's part of the tower, of course. It's the upper part. So those towers, including all the way to the top of the spires, are both about 300 feet. So we're talking about real space now. So this is what you're writing in the form analysis. It's obviously buildings don't have techniques for space. They are real space. So what are the dimensions? You only have to know two of them. The two towers are both about 300 feet, but to be exact, the shorter one is a little under 300, I think it's 285 or something, just say a bit under 300. And the taller one is a little more than 300 feet, but they average out to about 300 feet. Okay, so that's the height of the towers. And the only other dimension you should have in your notes on space is the height of the ceiling inside is about 110 feet. And the ceiling, it ends right here. This may look like it's part of the ceiling, it's just decoration here. So that's about 110 feet. And that's how the ceiling inside is. And we're going to see it in the very next slide, but we'll get to the details of that slide in a minute. Okay, then we have the rhythm. That's obvious with all these pointed arches here on the windows and even the decorative stone. Obviously, that's carving. It should be obvious. Stone carving over stained glass. That creates rhythm. That's why they call it a rose window, by the way, because it's supposed to look like a gigantic rose blossoming. It may or may not seem like that to some of you, but that was the concept as to why they designed these windows and called them rose windows. Now, a couple of you also very observantly may have noticed these windows are not pointed arched. They are Romanesque. I'll explain how did they get in the middle of the facade. Well, every other, I said some Gothic churches that not 100% of the doors and windows were pointed, but these three doors are.